It was a crisp autumn evening in Brighton Heights, where perfectly manicured lawns stretched before multi-million-dollar homes. Officer James Sullivan sat in his patrol car, parked strategically beneath the shadow of an old oak tree. He'd been working this wealthy district for 5 years, and he prided himself on what he called his sixth sense about things that didn't belong. The black Mercedes-Benz S-Class caught his eye the moment it turned onto Maple Avenue. The car itself wasn't unusual for this neighborhood. These streets were filled with luxury vehicles. But something about this one made Sullivan straighten in his seat. Maybe it was how the driver followed every traffic rule with almost painful precision, or perhaps it was just that feeling in his gut that had earned him so many good catches over the years. The Mercedes crawled past at exactly 25 miles per hour, the posted speed limit. The windows were tinted, but within legal limits. The license plate was clean, properly mounted, and current. Everything was perfect. Too perfect, Sullivan thought to himself as he pulled out behind the vehicle. He followed for 3 blocks, looking for any excuse, a rolling stop, a turn signal used, too late, anything. But the driver maintained textbook performance. Sullivan's fingers drummed against his steering wheel as his irritation grew. Finally, unable to find a legitimate reason but unwilling to let it go, he flipped on his lights. The Mercedes responded immediately, signaling properly before pulling to a perfect stop along the curb. Sullivan approached with his hand resting on his holster, flashlight beam cutting through the evening shadows. As he drew closer, he could see the driver, a young black woman in what appeared to be an expensive business suit, with her hands positioned exactly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. License and registration, Sullivan barked, his flashlight beam intentionally angled to shine in her side mirror, reflecting into her eyes. The woman's voice was calm and clear as she replied, "Officer, may I reach for my documentation in my glove compartment?" Her polite tone only irritated Sullivan more. He'd seen this before, or thought he had. People acting extra proper, driving expensive cars that couldn't possibly be theirs. The woman, who introduced herself as Maya Washington, moved with deliberate slowness as she retrieved her paperwork, narrating each motion. "I'm opening the glove compartment now. I'm reaching for my vehicle registration." The documentation she handed over was pristine: driver's license, registration, insurance, all current and properly organized in a leather portfolio. Sullivan studied each document with growing frustration, looking for any flaw or inconsistency. The car was registered in her name. The insurance was current. Her license showed an address in one of the most exclusive parts of Brighton Heights. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice sharp with authority. There was no legal reason for this command, and he knew it. But something about this woman, her composure, her apparent belonging in a neighborhood where he'd spent years looking for people who didn't belong, made him want to shake that calm exterior. Maya's hand moved slowly but purposefully toward her phone in its dashboard mount. "Officer," she said, her voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air, "I am informing you that I'm recording this interaction for both our safety. Now, could you please explain why you've pulled me over and why you're asking me to exit my vehicle?" Sullivan noticed how she kept her other hand visible on the steering wheel, how she maintained eye contact through the side mirror without turning to face him directly, how she seemed to know exactly how to handle this situation. His gut feeling shifted uncomfortably, not because he was wrong, but because this wasn't going the way these stops usually went. The night air had grown colder, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at nothing in particular. On this quiet street lined with legacy wealth and old money, a small crowd of residents had begun to gather on their perfectly maintained lawns, phones raised, witnessing what was quickly becoming more than just another traffic stop. The red and blue lights from Sullivan's patrol car painted the peaceful street in alternating colors, creating shadows that danced across the growing number of concerned faces watching from their front yards. Maya's phone continued recording, its small red light a silent witness to what was unfolding. "I asked you to step out of the vehicle," Sullivan repeated, his voice getting harder. His frustration was building. This stop wasn't following the script he played out countless times before. The woman's calmness felt like a challenge, though she hadn't done anything wrong. Maya took a slow, steady breath. Years of education at the finest schools had taught her many things, but it was her parents who had prepared her for moments like this. "Officer Sullivan," she said, reading his name from his badge, "I understand you're doing your job, but I need to know the reason for this stop. I've been following all traffic laws and regulations." Sullivan's jaw tightened. He leaned closer to the window, shining his flashlight across the leather interior of the Mercedes. "These documents look suspicious to me. We've had reports of stolen vehicles in the area." This wasn't exactly true. There hadn't been a car theft reported in Brighton Heights for over 6 months. Suspicious how, exactly? Maya's question was perfectly reasonable, her tone professional but firm. She'd spent the last 3 years handling high-stakes negotiations in corporate law offices, but this conversation on a dark street felt far more important than any boardroom debate. A light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and expensive gardenia bushes, the signature landscaping of Brighton Heights. More neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the uncommon sight of police lights in their quiet community. Some had begun recording on their phones, instinctively understanding that something wasn't right about this scene. "Ma'am, when an officer gives you an order, you comply," Sullivan said, his hand still resting on his holster. "Step out of the vehicle now." His voice carried the weight of authority, but there was something else there too. A note of uncertainty he was trying to mask with volume and force. Maya's legal training kicked in. "Officer, with all due respect, you need probable cause to order me out of my vehicle. I've provided all required documentation, which you've acknowledged receiving. If you can't articulate a specific reason for this stop or your request, I'm within my rights to..." "Out. Now." Sullivan's command cut through the night air, sharp enough to make several onlookers flinch. His patience had snapped, the simple traffic stop spiraling into something his pride wouldn't let him back away from. With deliberate movements, Maya pressed the button on her phone to save and back up the recording. She'd seen enough cases to know what might happen next. "I want to comply safely," she said clearly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm unfastening my seatbelt now. I'm opening my door slowly. I'm stepping out with my hands where you can see them." As Maya emerged from the car, her heels clicking softly on the pavement, her Harvard Law class ring caught the flash of red and blue lights. Her tailored suit, the one she'd worn earlier that day while winning a major case for her firm, suddenly felt like armor in a different kind of battle. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle," Sullivan ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. The metal clinked ominously in the quiet street. "Officer, this is unnecessary and potentially unlawful detention," Maya stated, her words measured and clear, not just for Sullivan, but for all the recording devices capturing this moment. "I've done nothing wrong." "You're resisting an officer," Sullivan shot back, though Maya hadn't moved. "That's probable cause right there." The words sounded hollow even to his own ears, but he was too far in now to back down. A voice called out from the gathering crowd, one of Maya's neighbors who had finally recognized her. "That's Miss Washington. She lives in the gray house on the corner." But Sullivan was already moving forward with the handcuffs, his face set in grim determination. Maya didn't resist as the cold metal closed around her wrists. She kept her voice level, knowing that every word mattered. "I want to be clear for the record. I'm complying under protest. I've committed no crime. This is an unlawful arrest, and I am invoking my right to remain silent and my right to legal representation." The gathering crowd murmured in disbelief as Sullivan led Maya to his patrol car. Someone in the audience was already on the phone, their urgent whispers carrying fragments of conversation. "Judge Washington, his daughter, you need to come quickly." But Sullivan didn't hear them. All he could focus on was getting this situation under control, unaware that every second was digging him deeper into a hole he wouldn't easily escape from. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Sullivan typed up his report, his fingers hitting the keyboard with unnecessary force. He'd done this hundreds of times before, writing up arrests, making the paperwork tell the story he wanted it to tell. But tonight felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The booking area was quiet except for the occasional radio chatter and the steady hum of ancient computer fans. Maya sat on a bench nearby, her posture still perfect despite the handcuffs, her expression composed. She hadn't said a word since arriving at the station, but somehow her silence felt louder than any protest. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Sullivan muttered, more to himself than to her. The charge of resisting an officer felt flimsy even as he typed it, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. If you just cooperated from the beginning. The station door burst open with a bang that made everyone jump. Captain Chen stormed in, his face the color of storm clouds. Behind him, 2 other officers exchanged worried glances. Sullivan had never seen the captain move so fast in all his years at the precinct. Sullivan. Chen's voice cracked like thunder across the booking area. My office. Now. He turned to the desk sergeant. Get those cuffs off her immediately. And somebody find her phone. Sullivan's stomach dropped at the captain's tone, but he tried to maintain his composure as he stood up. Sir, I can explain. This suspect was. Suspect. Chen's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Do you have any idea who you just arrested? Any idea at all? The desk sergeant was already apologetically removing Maya's handcuffs. She rubbed her wrists gently but remained silent, her eyes fixed on Sullivan with an expression that wasn't angry. It was something worse. It was disappointed. Inside the captain's office, with the door barely closed, Chen exploded. That's Federal Judge Washington's daughter out there. A Harvard law graduate who just made partner at Thompson & Mitchell, the same law firm that handles half the city's biggest cases. The room seemed to spin around Sullivan. He'd heard of Judge Washington, of course. Everyone in law enforcement had. The judge was known for being tough but fair, a respected figure who'd worked his way up from nothing to sit on the federal bench. And Sullivan had just arrested his daughter on a bogus charge. But the car, Sullivan's voice sounded weak even to his own ears. I thought. You thought what? Chen's words cut like ice. You thought that because she was black, she couldn't own a Mercedes? Couldn't live in Brighton Heights? What exactly were you thinking, Sullivan? Through the office window, Sullivan could see Maya speaking quietly with someone on her phone. Her composure made him feel even smaller. There was no screaming, no threats of lawsuits, just that same dignified presence that had irritated him so much during the traffic stop. The videos are already online, Chen continued, dropping into his chair with a heavy sigh. Her neighbors recorded everything. The department's phone is ringing off the hook. And you know what the worst part is? She didn't do a single thing wrong. Not one thing, Sullivan. This isn't going to be something we can sweep under the rug. Sullivan's throat felt dry as desert sand. What? What happens now? Now. Chen looked at him with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. Now we pray she doesn't sue the department into oblivion. Though given what I know about her work, she might do something even worse. She might try to help us fix the problem that led to this mess in the first place. The captain's words hung in the air like smoke. Outside the office, life in the station continued. Phones ringing, radios crackling, officers moving back and forth. But for Sullivan, everything had stopped. All his certainties, all his assumptions, all his pride in being able to spot trouble, it was all crumbling around him like a sandcastle in the rain. Go home, Sullivan, Chen finally said, his voice heavy with disappointment. You're on administrative leave pending investigation, and I'd start thinking real hard about what kind of officer you want to be, assuming you still have a badge after this is over. As Sullivan walked past the booking area, he couldn't help but look at Maya one last time. She was speaking with a group of senior officers now, her voice carrying clearly across the room. We need to talk about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. The night air felt cold on Sullivan's face as he left the station, but it wasn't nearly as cold as the realization that was finally beginning to sink in. He wasn't the hero of this story. He never had been. The morning sun couldn't break through the closed blinds in Sullivan's apartment, but the blue light from his phone lit up his unshaven face as he scrolled through yet another news article about the incident. 3 days had passed since the arrest, and the story wasn't going away. If anything, it was getting bigger. The videos, since nearly every neighbor had recorded the incident, had spread across social media like wildfire. Sullivan watched himself on the small screen, seeing his actions through others' eyes for the first time. Each viewing made him sink deeper into his couch, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. His phone buzzed with another text message. Friends and family had been reaching out, some supportive, others disappointed. This one was from his sister. Just saw Maya Washington on the morning news. You need to watch this. With trembling fingers, Sullivan found the interview online. Maya sat in a studio, looking polished and professional in a navy blue suit. The interviewer leaned forward, asking the question everyone wanted answered: "Why didn't you just sue the department?" Maya's response was measured, thoughtful. "Filing a lawsuit might make me feel better temporarily, but it wouldn't solve the underlying problem. This isn't about one officer or one incident. It's about patterns of behavior that need to change. I'm more interested in working with the department to develop better training and accountability systems." The camera zoomed in on her face as she continued. "When Officer Sullivan pulled me over, he saw what he expected to see, someone who didn't belong. But the real question is, why did he have those expectations in the first place? That's what we need to address." Sullivan clicked the video off, but Maya's words kept echoing in his head. He walked to his kitchen window, finally pulling up the blinds. The morning light hurt his eyes after so many days of hiding from the world. His phone rang, the captain this time. "The internal affairs investigation starts tomorrow," Chen said without preamble. "But there's something else you should know. Ms. Washington is going to be part of a community oversight panel reviewing police training procedures. She's already submitted some preliminary recommendations." Sullivan's throat tightened. "She's not pressing charges." "No," Chen replied, his voice a mixture of relief and something else, respect maybe. "But honestly, Sullivan, what she's proposing might be tougher than any legal punishment. She wants every officer in the department to confront their biases head-on. No more sweeping things under the rug." After hanging up, Sullivan made his first cup of coffee in days. The familiar routine helped calm his shaking hands. On TV, another news channel was showing clips from the incident, but this time they were paired with statistics about traffic stops and racial profiling. His personal mistake had become part of a larger conversation. His doorbell rang, startling him. It was his partner from the force, Officer Thompson, holding a newspaper. "You missed the town hall meeting last night," Thompson said, stepping inside. "Half the city was there. But here's the thing, it wasn't what you'd expect. People weren't just angry. They were talking about solutions." Sullivan took the newspaper, staring at the front page photo. It showed Maya standing at a podium, addressing a packed room. The headline read, "From Incident to Impact. Local Attorney Proposes Police Reform Initiative." The Internal Affairs Office felt smaller than Sullivan remembered. Maybe it was the stack of files covering every surface, or maybe it was just the weight of knowing that each Manila folder contained evidence of his past decisions. Investigator Rivera sat across from him, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose as she reviewed his traffic stop history. "Let's look at the numbers," Rivera said, spreading out several charts. "In the past year alone, you've pulled over 204 luxury vehicles. Of those stops, 85% involved minority drivers. Want to explain that pattern?" Sullivan shifted in his chair. A week ago, he would have had ready explanations. Statistics about crime patterns, stories about stolen vehicles, the usual defenses. But now those words felt like ash in his mouth. "I can't," he said quietly. "Not in any way that makes sense." Rivera nodded, making a note in her file. "We've interviewed some of the drivers from your previous stops. Many of them are successful professionals, doctors, lawyers, business owners. One was even a state senator. Each one has a story similar to Ms. Washington's." The air conditioning hummed in the background as Sullivan processed this information. Each file represented someone's bad day, someone's moment of feeling less than human, all because of his assumptions. Down the hall, in a different conference room, Maya was meeting with the police department's training committee. Her voice carried faintly through the walls. "We need to understand that these aren't just isolated incidents. They're symptoms of deeper issues." Rivera closed one file and opened another. "Your fellow officers describe you as a good cop in many ways. Your arrest record is solid. You've received commendations for bravery. But there's this blind spot, Sullivan. And it's a big one." On the wall behind Rivera, a clock ticked steadily. Each second seemed to echo the same question. How had he never noticed this about himself before? The door opened, and Captain Chen walked in with a thick binder. "The Community Oversight Committee just voted on Ms. Washington's proposals," he announced. "They're implementing new training protocols immediately. Sullivan, you're going to be part of the first group." Sullivan looked up, surprised. "You're not firing me." Ken exchanged glances with Rivera. Ms. Washington made a compelling argument against termination. She said, and I quote, "Firing officers who display bias without addressing the root causes just creates a revolving door. We need to transform the culture, not just punish individuals." The words hit Sullivan like a physical force. Even now, after everything he put her through, Maya was thinking about the bigger picture. Rivera pulled out another document. "We've been tracking luxury vehicle stops across all precincts. Your pattern isn't unique, Sullivan, it's just more pronounced." Ms. Washington's team analyzed 5 years of data and found similar trends throughout the department. Security cameras caught her leaving the building that afternoon, surrounded by senior officers and community leaders. She moved with the same quiet confidence she'd shown the night of her arrest, but now people were listening to her instead of making assumptions. Back in the Internal Affairs office, Sullivan studied a map showing his traffic stops over the past year. Each dot represented a moment when he'd let his biases override his judgment. The pattern was undeniable, like a constellation of mistakes spread across the city. "The sensitivity training starts next week," Chen said, breaking the heavy silence. But that's just the beginning. Ms. Washington's proposal includes regular community feedback sessions, data analysis reviews, and ongoing education about systemic bias. Sullivan looked at the next page in the report, a transcript from one of Maya's interviews. She'd said something that finally made everything click. "The goal isn't to shame anyone. The goal is to help everyone recognize these patterns so we can break them." Outside the building, the city continued its daily rhythm. Cars passed by, expensive ones, cheap ones, all carrying people with their own stories, their own lives, their own right to drive down any street without fear. Sullivan watched through the window, really seeing for the first time how his actions had affected so many lives. "There's one more thing," Rivera said, pulling out a final document. "Ms. Washington has requested that you participate in the community outreach program once your training is complete. She thinks your perspective, as someone who's confronting these issues directly, could be valuable." The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the files and charts and evidence of everything Sullivan had gotten wrong. But mixed with the shame was something new, small spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, his mistakes could help prevent others from making the same ones. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as officers filed in for their first sensitivity training session. Sullivan sat in the back row, his uniform feeling strangely tight around his neck. 2 weeks had passed since the Internal Affairs investigation, and every day had brought new revelations about his past behavior. The training room looked different from the usual police briefing spaces. Instead of straight rows facing forward, the chairs were arranged in a circle. Photos lined the walls, not mugshots or wanted posters, but portraits of community members, each with a story written beneath. "We're doing something different today," announced Dr. Rodriguez, the training facilitator. "We're going to listen to real experiences from members of our community, and our first speaker needs no introduction." Sullivan's heart skipped a beat as Maya Washington walked into the room. She wore a simple blue dress instead of her usual business suit, making her seem more approachable but no less commanding. The room fell silent as she took her place in the circle. "I'm not here to shame anyone," Maya began, her voice calm and clear. "I'm here because what happened to me isn't unique. It's just one story among thousands. But maybe it's a story we can learn from." She described that night from her perspective, the familiar feeling of tension when she saw the police lights, the practiced calm she'd learned to maintain, the silent prayers that this stop wouldn't be the one that went terribly wrong. Sullivan found himself holding his breath as she spoke. "The hardest part wasn't the handcuffs," Maya continued. "It wasn't the embarrassment of being arrested in front of my neighbors. It was knowing that no matter what I achieved, my education, my career, my character, none of it mattered in that moment. I was just someone who didn't belong." Other community members shared their stories throughout the day. A retired teacher described being pulled over 3 times in 1 month while driving his son's borrowed BMW. A business owner talked about watching customers leave his store whenever police came in for routine checks. A teenage boy explained how his parents had taught him exactly what to say and do during traffic stops, lessons he'd learned before he could even drive. During the lunch break, Sullivan couldn't eat. He sat alone in the corner, watching his fellow officers process what they'd heard. Some looked defensive, others seemed lost in thought, and a few were engaged in intense discussions with community members. The afternoon session focused on practical changes. Dr. Rodriguez led exercises about recognizing unconscious bias, while Maya and her team presented data showing how snap judgments could lead to discriminatory patterns in policing. "Watch this," Dr. Rodriguez said, playing a video of various people driving luxury cars. "Write down your first thought about each driver." When they reviewed their responses, many officers, including Sullivan, had to confront uncomfortable truths about their assumptions. "The goal isn't to make you feel guilty," Maya explained as they analyzed their responses. "The goal is to make you aware. Awareness is the first step toward change." Near the end of the day, they practiced traffic stop scenarios with role-playing exercises. Sullivan volunteered to go first, his hands shaking slightly as he approached a simulated vehicle. This time, he focused on behavior, not appearances. He listened more than he spoke. He explained each action before taking it. "Better," Maya said after the exercise. "But what made you decide to ask for additional documentation when the initial papers were in order?" Sullivan paused, catching himself falling back into old habits. The room waited for his response, but it wasn't hostile. They were all learning together. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows through the community center windows, Maya gathered everyone for a final discussion. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said. "It happens in small moments, in daily choices, in the constant work of questioning our assumptions." Sullivan looked around the room at his fellow officers. Some nodded in agreement, others still seemed uncertain, but everyone was thinking, really thinking, about their role in making things better. The day ended with another round of stories, but this time it was the officers sharing moments when they'd realized their own biases or made mistakes they regretted. Each story was a small crack in the wall between us and them, letting in light where there had only been shadow. As people filed out, Sullivan overheard two rookie officers talking. "I never thought about it this way before," one said. "Makes you wonder how many times we've gotten it wrong without even knowing." Maya caught his eye as she gathered her materials. There was no anger there, no resentment, just a steady determination to turn one bad night into something meaningful. Sullivan realized that transformation wasn't just about changing procedures or policies. It was about changing hearts, one difficult conversation at a time. 6 months had passed since that night on Brighton Heights. The police station looked the same from the outside, but inside things were different. New posters about community policing lined the walls. The morning briefings now included reviews of stop data and community feedback. Small changes, but meaningful ones. Sullivan stood in front of the station, adjusting his tie. He wasn't in uniform today. After weeks of consideration, he'd finally requested a meeting with Maya through proper channels. Her office had responded with a simple time and place, a small coffee shop halfway between the station and her law firm. The coffee shop was busy with morning customers when Sullivan arrived. Maya sat at a corner table, a stack of papers beside her coffee cup. She looked up as he approached, her expression neutral but not unwelcoming. "Officer Sullivan," she said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "Just James today," he replied, his voice surprisingly steady despite his racing heart. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Steam rose from their coffee cups as silence settled between them. Sullivan had practiced this moment countless times in his head, but now that it was here, all his prepared words felt inadequate. "I owe you an apology," he finally said, his hands wrapped around his cup to stop them from shaking. "Not just for that night, but for every time I let my biases affect my judgment. For every person I made feel less than human because of my assumptions." Maya watched him carefully, letting him continue. "The training sessions opened my eyes, but it was more than that. Watching you turn what I did into something positive, it showed me what real strength looks like. You had every right to be angry, to want revenge. Instead, you chose to make things better." A young couple walked past their table, laughing about something. Through the window, morning traffic flowed by, all kinds of people in all kinds of cars, heading to all kinds of places. Sullivan saw them differently now. "I've been working with the new officer training program," he continued, sharing my story, helping them understand how easy it is to let biases cloud your judgment. It's not easy, admitting to my mistakes in front of new recruits. But if it helps prevent even one incident like what happened with you. Maya nodded, pulling a document from her stack of papers. I've heard about your work with the program. The feedback has been positive. Officers seem to respond well to hearing from someone who's been through this journey. It's not enough, Sullivan said. It'll never be enough to make up for. This isn't about making up for anything, Maya interrupted gently. It's about moving forward, about turning awareness into action. She slid the document across the table. It was a proposal for expanding the training program to other police departments in the region. Sullivan's name was listed as one of the primary speakers. Your perspective is valuable, Maya explained. You're living proof that people can change when they're willing to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. Outside, the morning sun had risen fully, warming the coffee shop's windows. Sullivan looked at the proposal, then back at Maya. Why are you giving me this chance? Because change doesn't happen from the outside, she said. It happens when people inside the system stand up and say, we can do better. You've shown you're willing to do that. Sullivan thought about the past 6 months, the hard conversations, the moments of shame, the slow process of rebuilding his understanding of what it meant to serve and protect. He thought about all the Maya Washingtons out there who deserved better from their police officers. I'll do it, he said. But I want to be clear about something. I'm not doing this to clear my conscience or repair my reputation. I'm doing it because it needs to be done. Maya smiled for the first time since he'd sat down. That's exactly why I think you're the right person for this. As they finished their coffee, they talked about the future, about plans for community engagement, about changes still needed, about hope for better days ahead. When they finally stood to leave, Sullivan felt lighter somehow, as if setting down a burden he'd carried for too long. Back at the station, he hung up his tie and put his uniform back on. There were still calls to answer, still streets to patrol. But now, every time he looked in his rearview mirror, he saw more than just vehicles and drivers. He saw people, each with their own stories, their own dignity, their own right to drive through any neighborhood without fear. The badge on his chest caught the light as he headed out for his shift. It meant something different now, not just authority but responsibility. Not just power, but the duty to use it wisely. One traffic stop had changed everything. But maybe that's how change always happens, one moment, one choice, one person at a time.